Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Former President Donald Trump said that if elected, he would not defend NATO members that don't meet defense spending targets. President Biden has made strengthening coalitions against adversaries a central tenet of his foreign policy. Today we discuss the difference in how two American presidents view America's role in the world.
No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
For as long as I'm president, if Putin attacks a NATO ally, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory.
We believe it's enhancing the security and extended deterrence in the US-ROK alliance.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as a deputy national security advisor during the George W. Bush administration. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and to Albania. Also joining us, Mr. Christopher Johnstone, Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Johnstone was the Director for East Asia at the National Security Council under President Biden. He also served as the Director for Japan and Oceanian Affairs at the NSC, Principal Director for South and Southeast Asia, as well as Director for Northeast Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, former President Donald Trump said that if elected, he may encourage Russia to attack NATO members who do not meet the defense spending target of 2% of the GDP. During his first term in office, President Trump said that South Korea and Japan are getting defense free ride from United States. Should President Trump get a second term, how does his disparagement of U.S. security commitment to NATO extend onto U.S. mutual defense treaty with South Korea and Japan?
First of all, thanks for having me on. Second, it's very hard to predict future events with a future president, even one who has previously been president, and above all with Donald Trump. And thirdly, the very comments he made are destructive of what we've put together with our partners and allies, including Korea and many scores others since the end of World War II, to promote peace, prosperity, and political development very successfully around the world, including in Korea. That said, President Trump likes to express things in a particularly aggressive, extreme manner. But I don't want to downplay what he said because, as we know, and as you mentioned, in his last administration, he put a considerable pressure on both NATO states and on our East Asian allies, Japan and Korea, to pay more. This is the transactional mindset that Trump has. He's also what his close political ally, Senator J.D. Vance, calls, and others, a Jacksonian in foreign policy. That is, somewhat isolationist, but then very aggressive when challenged. Trump will push very hard for NATO states to do more.
Mr. Johnson, according to NATO, United States spent $860 billion or 3.49% of GDP on defense last year, which is more than double the entire amount of all NATO countries' defense spending combined. Isn't it a legitimate concern that NATO should be spending more on defense, which was also raised by Presidents Bush and Obama?
It's completely a legitimate issue. Every Secretary of Defense that I worked for focused on getting our allies, whether in Europe or in Asia, to spend more on their own defense. So this is, in that sense, not a new issue. As the ambassador, I think, has very well said. I guess I would make 2 points on this. First, you have to look at the trend line, right? And the trend line is positive in NATO and it's positive in Asia. Our allies are spending more than they were before on defense. The NATO Secretary General, I think yesterday, said that 18 of the 31 countries of NATO are going to hit the 2% mark this year. So that's progress. The other point is that alliances are not charity. We have alliances in Europe, the United States does. We have NATO, we have our alliances with Japan and South Korea because it's in the American interest too. And those alliances have prevented major war for 80 years. I think it's very interesting that Putin has not expanded the war beyond Ukraine. He has not attacked, for example, supply transshipment points in Poland. And that's because he's deterred. He's deterred by the NATO commitment. So this is not charity. And it's appropriate to lean on allies to spend more, to do their part, and they should continue to do so. But it's important to have a larger view of why we have alliances in the first place.
Specifically on South Korean burden sharing, Washington and Seoul do not disclose the exact proportion of the burden sharing, but according to South Korean media reports in 2021, South Korea shouldered 51% of the burden, and in 2025, that number will rise to 59%. Would that be considered adequate amount for U.S. presidents other than President Trump?
Yeah, so I was a part of multiple cost-sharing negotiations over the years in my time in government, including one with South Korea in 2013. And we never used this number of percentage of total costs because we would get lost in a debate bilaterally about how you calculate it. The cost-sharing agreement with Korea covers specific things. It covers labor, Korean laborers on U.S. bases. It covers construction on U.S. facilities. And it covers some operational costs for U.S. forces in Korea. And the question is whether those areas are fairly shared. And I think the answer is clearly yes. The current agreement reflects an 8% increase over the last one, clearly headed in the right direction. And Korea itself spends, I think, 2.7% of GDP on defense. Now, we should always be talking to South Korea about how much it spends in defense, what it's investing in, whether we're adequately addressing the threat. But looking at this picture, it's a positive one, and it's positive in Japan too.
Ambassador Jeffrey, Presidents Carter and Nixon also considered withdrawing U.S. forces Korea, but U.S. forces Korea continues to this day. Do you think President Trump's view is entirely different from previous U.S. presidents who also considered pulling U.S. troops out of Korea?
That's a really good question, and I'll give you a somewhat complicated answer. Particularly in the case of President Carter, I know some of the background, and senior officials convinced him that this was a very bad idea, not just for Korea and for Asian peace, but also for the United States. I was responsible, as you noted, for Syria during the Trump administration, and he twice ordered our troops to leave Syria. They're still there. Why? Because senior officials were able to explain to him why it was in America's interest, not just to fight the Islamic State, but to deny terrain to our foes, Russia and Iran, in the region. And once he understood that, he fell off of his effort to pull troops out. So I think a lot depends on who is advising him and the arguments they use.
Mr. Johnstone, can President Trump's remarks can be dismissed as one leader's opinion, just a unique tendency of an individual, or isn't there a greater wave of thinking from constituents that are tired of U.S. internationalism, that want to put U.S. national interest first and would not want to be world police anymore?
Sure, that's right. I think when President Trump voices these views, he's not speaking alone, right? There's always been an isolationist element in the American body politic. It sort of ebbs and flows over time. I do think it's important not to overstate it, though. I thought it was very interesting, this supplemental budget package that includes support for Ukraine, the Middle East, and Taiwan. 70 senators ended up voting for that. 70. And I think there's a reason why the Speaker of the House doesn't want the bill to get to the House floor, because an overwhelming majority of representatives in the House would vote for it too. So it's important to keep things in perspective. I think the solid mainstream of American public opinion remains supportive of engagement in the world. The details are debated. How much we should spend in various commitments is debated. But fundamentally, I still think we're an internationalist country. At least I hope so.
If I may make a brief, not challenge, but an addition to what Mr. Johnstone said. The American people have seen 3 administrations. The Clinton administration, the Bush 43 administration, and the first half of the Obama administration go on crusades for internal nation building with the help of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps since 1995 until roughly 2012. This was low cost and relatively successful under Clinton. It was low cost, but essentially a total failure of the Arab Spring under President Obama. And it was both very high cost and in the end, Iraq and Afghanistan, more or less a total failure under that president. And the American people are reacting to that. They want to see, is this another repeat? What's the end game? Why is this in our interest? We didn't make that, we thought we made that case, but we clearly didn't during that period of 20 years. And we're living, frankly, with the results of that today.
So all those presidents, as you mentioned, started off as focusing on U.S. domestic issues, but then got entangled into international wars.
They did because of a kind of, and it was shared by both parties, from left to right, international social justice as a use of American power. In principle, who can be against democracy, as George Bush always emphasized, who could be against the Arab world, having a positive revolution, as President Obama pushed for. The problem is we're not good at doing this.
Mr. Johnstone, you said you hope U.S. would be internationalist, but didn't United States start off as isolationist? And there are many critics who point out the weakness of internationalism.
Sure, and I completely agree with Ambassador Jeffrey that we are paying the cost for American intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan and the toll that took on both American lives but also American treasure. But if you look at public opinion polls, there's still strong public support for American participation in NATO, still strong American support for the alliances with Japan and South Korea. So this is not a comprehensive retreat, I don't believe. And there's also strong American support. It's gone down, but still strong support to Ukraine. So I do think it's important not to overread. This is not a wholesale retreat from the world, but it does, I think, underscore that a president needs to make the case for American involvement. It's not automatic, and the memories of the American public are certainly strong as a result of these recent experiences.
I want to push just a little bit more. Ambassador Jeffrey, Mr. Johnstone just talked about opinion polls that support NATO, but at the same time, there are many Americans who support President Trump, who's the front runner in the Republican race. Isn't that contradicting?
No, not at all, because first of all, these Americans are focused on domestic policy, notably the economy, specifically inflation, immigration, and certain social issues. They're not focused on foreign policy because, all in all, we're not at war, and they benefit from the success that we have had around the world that we've talked about today. The other thing is, one thing that conservatives, including those supporting President Trump, really do believe in is containing China. And President Trump certainly believes in that. And it's very hard to see how you do that without supporting your 2 top allies in the East Asia area, South Korea and Japan. The problem with NATO is a little bit different. Trump really thinks we should do a deal with Putin, kind of like we did right after 1989 in Europe. And, the whole history of NATO expansion and such is very controversial. And Trump understands that. He's heard about it from, at the time, former Secretary Kissinger and others. And that motivates him to think that he can do things in Europe that I don't think he's going to try to do in East Asia. His record there is pretty clear.
Mr. Johnstone, President Trump is sometimes depicted as deriding allies, but during his term, he had very special relationship with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. If he would have the second term, what would be the key takeaway for South Korean leaders?
The key takeaway is that it's unpredictable. It's true that he had a close relationship with Prime Minister Abe. That's a well-known story. How that relationship, however, was not based on some common worldview or a common set of objectives or shared policy views. It derived from the fact that Abe was very effective at building a relationship with President Trump early on. Went to see him. I think he was among the first leaders to meet with Trump after he was elected. Went to New York to meet him. Angered the Obama administration in the process, right? The classic American view that we have one president at a time. So that was the foundation. And so I think the lesson to draw is there's unpredictability here, right? Of course, South Korea should do what it can to build a relationship with President Trump if there is a second term. But it should also, I think, be realistic and be prepared for a world that might feature less U.S. engagement, less support for allies. And that's a reality that is probably worth considering in Seoul.
So if President Trump were to have a second term, what position will the second Trump administration have on South Korea's nuclear drive?
It will, on that portfolio, I'm almost certain the advice Trump would get in his own fairly extensive negotiations with the North Koreans on the nuclear issue would lead to a strong position. No, don't go there. Rely on the American deterrence and the American commitments, which, as you know, in the case of Korea, are extraordinary, immediate, devastating, and effective responses.
Mr. Johnstone, the idea for the U.S., South Korea, Japan cooperation is to institutionalize it so that the gains wouldn't be wiped out because of political changes. Now, the Nuclear Consultative Group, South Korea and United States recently decided to have the Defense Department take charge of that organ. And the Defense Department now having charge of NCG, how does that contribute to the independence and the continuation of NCG?
Yeah, it's not surprising to me that they took this step. That's sort of a common pattern, right? That White House, the president, negotiate, conclude, and announce an agreement with a partner, and then the implementation, the execution of the initiative gets handed off to the appropriate department or agency. So I'm not surprised at all that the Department of Defense will be in the driver's seat for the Nuclear Consultative Group. And I do think it helps to institutionalize this as an ongoing forum, right? I mean, that means that more people will be involved. It means that it becomes a regular part of the agenda for defense leaders. There will be a budget internally that underpins it. But it is also the case that that's not necessarily ironclad, right? I mean, any leader has the right to set their own agenda and priorities. And so handing this off to the Department of Defense doesn't inevitably mean that the NCG endures, but I think it gives it stronger roots in the American system. And I think a new Trump administration would see this body as useful and advancing American interests.
Ambassador Jeffrey, the premise of Nuclear Consultative Group is that South Korea does not have nuclear weapons. So if there is a case where North Korea attacks South Korea with a nuclear weapon, by the time the United States retaliates, then South Korea would have already been hit by North Korean nuclear weapon. Then how can Washington and Seoul overcome this contradiction?
The contradiction is there, but the way deterrence theory works is if the North Koreans are sure that the American response will be, as President Biden has said and other presidents have said in other ways, will be immediate, overwhelming, and decisive, and will include, if they use nuclear weapons, the entire span of American weapons, including nuclear weapons, that we believe should deter them. The other thing is we may well see advance warning of a North Korean attack, be it conventional or nuclear, a massive attack on South Korea. Then, in consultation with the South Koreans, the United States president would decide what preemptive action to take. And that could be across the span, even under certain circumstances, a nuclear response. So I think that as long as the North Koreans know that, and the American commitment to these principles remains as strong as it is now under the Biden administration, I think we'll be fine.
But isn't the deterrence theory a very dangerous one, relying on the premise of mutual destruction?
At the end of the day, particularly if you assume that North Korea, with their new intercontinental ballistic missiles, can strike the United States with nuclear warheads and overwhelm our anti-ballistic missile defenses, yes, but we have lived with that. The United States political system and the United States people have lived with that since the Soviet Union 50 years ago obtained the ability to strike the United States, and it has still worked to keep the world largely peaceful without any nuclear attacks now since 1945.
But didn't President Reagan think that it was crazy, and that's why he started the Star Wars program?
He thought, well, he did several things. He started the Star Wars program. He also tried to eliminate in Reykjavik all nuclear weapons with President Gorbachev. President Reagan, somewhat like President Trump, would think, as we say, outside the box or totally tip the box upside down. But again, Koreans, like Germans, like British, like Mexicans, have to deal with a sometimes complicated big brother in Washington. And presidents often say things, but look what we have done including in the Trump administration over the last 80 years. We haven't deviated that much from the basic principles laid down in the Truman administration because they work for everybody, including we Americans.
Mr. Johnstone, North Korea's Kim Yo-jong said that Pyongyang is open to improving relations with Japan, including the possibility of Prime Minister Kishida visiting Pyongyang. Now, there are some conditions attached to that, but what do you make of North Korea's proactive outreach to Japan?
Yeah, I think they think they see an opportunity. I think they're wrong, but I think they see an opportunity perhaps to try to divide Japan, the United States, and South Korea. Prime Minister Kishida has been calling for dialogue with North Korea directly on the abductee issue for weeks at this point. There is some political pressure on this issue in Japan. The abductee families, of course, are getting quite old. There's a sense of limited time. Prime Minister Kishida's support ratings are not high. So that's in the backdrop here. Now, there's also, I think it's fair to say, a history of Japan not being entirely transparent with the United States, with South Korea on its engagements related to the abductee issue. I think this time is different. I think Japan very much understands the importance of remaining tough on the core security issues, the missile issues, the nuclear question. So I don't think this is a 2002 kind of scenario at all. My guess is that North Korea hopes that it will be and hopes that it can push Japan in that direction. But we'll see. I do think it's interesting that the U.S. Special Envoy for Human Rights in North Korea yesterday came out supportive of Japan's outreach on this. And it would be beneficial. You can see how it could be beneficial to have a channel that we've been unable to establish otherwise with the North Korean leadership. So I think regardless of what North Korea's intentions may be, I think this is a potential opportunity and not necessarily a bad thing, and I think it's different from 20 years ago.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Johnstone, Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.